Today's special US engagement mission episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. Whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns, or an organisation driving change in the community, Dunn develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people from around the world that share the same values and organises them to achieve common goals from the ground up. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Hello, my name is Stephen Donnelly and welcome to episode 19 of Socially Democratic, a weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. Today's special episode is a recording in conjunction with the Dunn United States Engagement Mission, a program that connects leading Australian social democrats with leaders in policy, government advocacy and tech in the United States, in particular in Washington, D.C. and New York. And we're recording this particular episode in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And if you're interested in joining the 2020 mission to the United States, you should hit up Dunn on our social media platforms, including LinkedIn. On today's episode, we were joined by the National Field Director of Colour of Change, Shannon Talbert. Colour of Change is the nation's largest online racial justice organisation. And Shannon spoke about her pathway into organising and the various campaigns that Colour of Change have ran and won, including the fight against mass incarceration and holding prosecutors accountable. Don't forget, this podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and all of your favourite podcast apps. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review, and don't forget to share it on all of your various social media platforms. And for any updates, just follow Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, including all of the great meetings and sessions that we've been having with some of these organisations in the United States over the past week. You can get updates on all of that on all of our social media platforms. Now, let's go to this week's episode. Hello, we're taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C. We're at the headquarters of Colour of Change. I just double-check what day it was because we're extremely jet-lagged and we're on this Dunn Street mission across the United States and talking to some amazing organisations. And as I said, we're at one particular amazing organisation that's doing some fantastic work in the organising space. And it's great to have on the podcast today Shannon Talbert, who is the National Field Director of Colour of Change. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
Now, we've literally just finished a session with the Australian delegation, and your voice is probably at its limits right now because you just ran a pretty impressive training with our guys.
I really got to breathe a little bit at the end, so you all did all the talking at the end.
We did, actually. You're a very good trainer when it comes to that. Today, a lot of our listeners back home in Australia don't know much about Colour of Change, and we're going to talk a bit about that in a moment. But first of all, I just want to sort of let our listeners get a sense of who you are and your journey into campaigning. Talk us through how you first came to be involved in organising, because you're a teacher by trade initially. Did teaching come first, or did organising come first?
I would say it's a little bit of who knows what. So I grew up in Atlanta, and in the 6th grade, my parents had to make a really tough choice. They removed me from a private school earlier, and my dad had lost his job, and he had to decide, because we couldn't afford the private school, my brother and I were going to have to go to a different type of school. The schools in our neighborhood weren't the best schools, and they were largely at the point that you transition into middle school in Atlanta, it's a very split system. The north side has really good schools, and the south side did not have the best schools. They had great teachers, they had great resources, but at the end of the day, those schools were better resourced and better equipped. And so my mom made a really tough decision to put us on a bus when we had never ridden a bus before, for 45 minutes in the morning to transport us across school, and that was where I saw the differences in public education. I walked into this school that had a massive hallway. It was completely different from the school in my area. And it was one of those things that it was just like, wow, this exists.
Yeah.
That first day, I'd cried all about that day because I didn't want to leave my neighborhood school and all my friends. And also I had to ride the bus, which I had never done before. And we got up and it was dark. And so that propelled me to look at the inequality in education. I had always thought I was going to go into something about economics. And so in college, I took a lot of economics courses and then decided that wasn't for me. Then I transferred to a history major and that wasn't for me. And then I got into a government and politics program and decided, oh, this could be pretty cool. And so I had some big sisters through my sorority who encouraged me to think about what I was going to do after school. And I had taken a joint program where I was doing government and politics and education. Mm-hmm. And I was already teaching at a sixth grade school, working with boys, sixth grade boys who were severely developmentally challenged, but also suffering from behavior issues. Mm-hmm. And it was an all-boys classroom. And they said, well, what are you going to do? And I hadn't gotten a job yet. And I decided in 2007 that I was going to pack up and move to South Carolina to go work on the Obama campaign. And so I did that and traveled all through 2007 and 2008 across the country doing races for Obama, learning a lot about engagement organizing and how to engage the community in these wins. And then I went back to the classroom. And that was a really long journey, but I was excited to be back in the classroom. And 2 years later, I lost my job and had to make another choice.
Now, let's, before we talk about that particular choice, talk me through the thought process that led you to want to go and organise for Obama. So I had for me, it was about education. And Obama spoke to the hope of the country. And the ideals of America. And I was looking for that candidate who was going to put that forward. And it was a really big opportunity at the time. Everybody was just like, oh, he can't. And I was like, why can't he? And I got a call one night from Jeremy Byrd, who was the field director in South Carolina. He asked me a few questions, and embarrassingly at the time I was in Walmart, and he worked for Stop Walmart. But he called me back, and he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said I wanted to come to South Carolina. And so he said, well, come on, and we'll have a spot for you. That's a pretty amazing phone call, given the career that Jeremy Byrd ultimately went on to have in OFA alumni law.
Yeah.
So you went and organised for Obama in South Carolina. What were those experiences initially as an organiser for you?
It was a first-time thing. It was really scary. But it was also great. There were so many people who were engaged. It was where the Fired Up, Ready to Go chant came from, because I was in Greenwood, South Carolina, and Edith Childs, who started that chant, was the person who was elected at the time in Greenwood. So she would come into the office regularly. She would cheer us on. But ultimately, it was my first experience engaging people and asking them to do something. And getting to that place where you're comfortable asking people to take action was the biggest challenge that I faced. I ended up working out of a funeral home. So my staging location was based in a funeral home because that was where the community went for their information. Mr. Pratt, he was a trusted community source, and that's where everybody gathered, and everybody knew him. He had been in the community forever in Newberry, South Carolina, and so we ended up having a lot of folks canvass Newberry out of the funeral home.
The experience you had with Obama, then you went back to teaching, you said?
After 2008. So I ended up in Florida for the general election, and then I moved back to Maryland and went back to education. And for me, that was largely about doing my part as a teacher for these students that I was committed to.
How a lot of our organisers back home in Australia, they find that they come off this high from organising in a campaign. It's tough work, but it's energizing and it's electric, and the relationships that you make with volunteers in those communities are so powerful and so everlasting as well. And then you kind of go back to, the real world in air quotes, but obviously, it's not, but it's just sort of like, oh, now what do I do? How did you find that when you went from organising, very, very historic election campaign in the history of this great nation to going back into teaching? How did you focus your energies in then, trying to educate young people?
Well, actually, I used everything that I learned as an organizer in my classrooms. And so one of the things that we always said on the Obama campaign that was our goal was to work ourselves out of a job. So to give the ownership away and to teach others how to realize the change for their communities that they want to see. And so I did the same thing for my students, and I did the same thing with their parents. We ended up working on a curriculum compacting program in Prince George's County for kindergarten students. One of the things that was happening in my classroom, my kids were largely black kids who were on the south side of town, south side of the county, and they were finishing the year on grade level, but they were coming back to first grade, and they were not on grade level when it came to reading. And what happens is at the north end of the county, there's a lot more resources. Parents have better jobs and things like that. They're less transient. So they're going to the libraries. What I found was that my kids had to get as far ahead during the year so that they would come back on grade level. And we taught parents as well as we taught students, and built a collective program amongst our primary school teachers to make sure that parents were supported in that and students were supported in their learning. So everything that I learned, I ended up using in my classrooms. And so it gave me additional highs.
So we had last week on the podcast a woman by the name, a very inspiring woman, in fact, a woman by the name of Michaela Settle, who was a field organiser in our 2014 state election, a very successful state election for the Labor Party. She's now a member of Parliament, and in fact the first member of the field alumni to go and seek public office and be elected.
That's exactly what we like to see.
Absolutely. It's that pipeline of people coming through volunteerism into organising and then into public office. And she spoke of the same thing, that the things that she learned as an organiser, she's applied in so many different aspects of her life, and she's continuing to do that in public office. And it's just reaffirming to hear that. But then, obviously, like in the journey of life, you've then found yourself heading over to the United Arab Emirates. Talk us through how you came into that circumstance and your experiences there.
Yeah, my principal called me into her office, and she was all teary-eyed, and I wasn't really sure because she was very stern. And she told me that she was going to have to let me go because of budget cuts. And so I found myself in a situation where I had massive student loans. And so my payments were about $900 a month, and I was probably making $2,000 a month at the time.
Which is the experience of a lot of students in this country, right?
Yes. And it was one of the major it's one of the major issues that I am most concerned about. But also thinking about that, it was, okay, well, this is an opportunity to do something you've always wanted to do. And for me, what I always wanted to do was work outside of the States and think about ways in which I can learn from the other countries. And so I had talked to a recruiter, and I really, really wanted to go to Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always interested in Islamic culture, and Saudi Arabia seemed the most extreme, and you can't get in there unless you had a job there. And so I was like, I want to go there.
There's a challenge.
And so I talked to a recruiter, and she said, "Are you married?" And I said, "No." And she said, "I think life would be very difficult for you there." And I said, I'm okay. I'm ready for that. I'm prepared for that. And she said, "I'm letting you know I will not send you there." And she said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend you for this program in the UAE. And I said, "Where is that?" And she said, "Do you know where Dubai is?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, that's the UAE." And I said, "Oh, okay." And at the time, I had an interview in New York. I went up for the interview in New York, and it was an Australian guy. His name was Richard. He interviewed me, and he got through 2 questions. He said, "Describe your classroom." And I wasn't finished describing my classroom, and he said, "I'll be your mentor. Do you want to go to the UAE?" And I said, "Like right now?" And his thing was, "Yeah, like right now." And I said, I need time. I wasn't expecting this to happen. I thought we would have an interview, there would be a decision, you would call me back, and I would get some time to think about it. He said, well, I'm making you an offer, and I would be the person who's your mentor. So if you want to go, let me know.
Typical
you have 24.
No stuffing around, just get to the point.
Exactly. So I said, well, can you send me the contract at least first? So he sent me the contract. It was full Arabic. My mom at the time, luckily, worked with a guy who spoke Arabic, and he read all through it. And he said, looks good. And she said, well, can you type up at least what it says? And he said, sure, I'll do that for you. And he did. And I signed the contract. And so I worked in Abu Dhabi for 5 years. And at a certain point, I felt like I was watching the Black Lives Matter movement from an international perspective, and my friends were asking me all these questions. My friends were folks from Ireland and from Australia. We had a few Kiwis. And so all these questions were, why is it so bad in America? And it was at that moment that I felt like it was time for me to go home and do work on behalf of Black people.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do? What was the first step you took to go on?
So the first step I took, I believe my contract was due in March of that year of 2016 to say that I was going to come back or that I wasn't going to come back. Yeah. And in December, I called up Kwesi, who was my friend, and I talked to him about what I wanted to do. And I told him I wanted to do something that impacted Black boys and really focused on education, but wasn't necessarily in the classroom. I said I wanted to focus from a policy level, and he was like, great, you should talk to the unions. And so I talked to a few friends at the unions, did that, and they said, you don't want to come here. And not because it wasn't the place to be, it was just the work that I was saying that I wanted to do, they didn't feel like I would be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And so a few months passed. I talked to some folks at the National Education Association.
Which is essentially the teachers' union?
It is an association that advocates on behalf of teachers, but they are affiliated with a lot of different associations around the country, the different teachers' associations. And they said, no, for what you want to do, this isn't the type of program for you. Yeah. And then eventually I called Kwesi back and told him Kwesi was working at the Center for Popular Democracy, but he was about to take a job at Color of Change. Yeah. And so he said, hey, I've got this new program. It's pretty innovative. We're going to go after district attorneys and hold them accountable, and it's only 3 months. And I said, that sounds perfect. At the time, I was building an app, and I wanted to still be able to focus on that. And so I said, I'll do it. And I did it, and I ended up loving it. And I found out in December that the training manager at Color of Change was leaving to go back to school. And I said, how do I get that job? Because I want to stay now. Yeah. And I ended up talking to my boss's boss to ask for that job. And she said, we'll figure out a way. And then I ended up getting 3 other offers at the exact same time. So, of course, you know, the money hits and people start talking about all the things you could do, and they're innovative and you can dream. And so I ended up deciding to come to Color of Change after a conversation with our now Vice President, Arisha Hatch, where she flew into town to tell me about this program and tell me about what I could make it into and what I could do with it if I stuck around. And that was a powerful experience because Color of Change has been very innovative year after year. My role here has changed year after year, and the things that I've had the opportunity to do, largely around organizing, impacting members, training, have been across the gamut, the widest spectrum of work that I've ever been able to do.
Talk us through what the primary objectives of Color of Change for the folks back home in Australia.
Yeah, so we are a Black-led organization, and we are building the largest Black-led grassroots program. And so we have 1.7 million members. Our goal is to engage all of those members in strategic actions in order to hold decision makers accountable. This year, we have a goal. Largely, we have what we call a C3, which does education work, a C4, which does expressed advocacy work, and a Super PAC, which does electoral work on behalf of candidates. A lot of the work that I do is around our C4 issue-based work and our Super PAC work to elect candidates. And so our district attorney work is what we're really preparing for in 2020. And we want to make sure that we are electing champions for our community that will stand up for what we are asking for.
Give us an example of some of the campaigns that you've run in the past, that Colour of Change have run in the past that had some great success, because you've actually got a couple of good, one for a better term, a good hit list of, almost like a top 5, records of all time kind of scenario that you've done well in. Talk us about one of those.
So we've run campaigns against ALEC, which is a lobbying group here in the States. We've run campaigns against a lot of corporate actors. We've had some really huge media successes, getting Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly off the air. And then we also run member-led campaigns through our platform called Organize 4. We recently just ran one called Let Aggies Vote, in which we were fighting for voting rights and access on campus for students. And so a lot of the campaigns that we do, we have a model in which we really focus on corporate accountability and attacking the enablers. And so making it okay for companies to change their policies and demanding that they change their policies.
The ALEC campaign that you mentioned sort of intersected with Trayvon Martin when he was murdered. Talk us through that particular campaign, because that is quite insightful in terms of the good work that you guys do.
Yeah, so ALEC was responsible for the Stand Your Ground laws that allowed George Zimmerman to get off. ALEC was also responsible for passing a host of voter ID laws in a bunch of different states, largely focused on the Southeast, but also other states and other areas. And it was about limiting representation and denying voters the access to participate in the process. And so ultimately, we saw the connection when the Stand Your Ground laws came up, and we were able to see, ALEC's pushing all of these. Corporate enablers were allowing ALEC to operate, and we pursued a strategy in which we wanted to drain the money from ALEC. And so we tied their enablers to the corporations and pretty much used incendiary language to ensure that the corporations felt that they had to be accountable to our communities. If you're marketing in a Black community and if you're selling to a Black community, you should think about the actions that you're going to take. And some of the largest players in that were Coke and Pepsi. And we wanted to make sure that they knew the impact of the work that they were supporting.
It was maybe unpack the Stand Your Ground laws in the United States and how that kind of around the case of Trayvon and.
Yeah, so Trayvon Martin was walking down the street, and one of the things, he had on a hoodie. He put his hand in his pocket, and George Zimmerman was a vigilante. He called himself a neighborhood advocate. He didn't recognize this kid in his neighborhood, and because he had on a hoodie and saw him reaching in his pocket, he assumed that he was in danger, and so he was able to defend himself according to the Stand Your Ground law.
And so the work that you guys have done is, where is these Stand Your Ground laws right now? Talk me through that. Have we had any success in trying to overturn that at a legislative level? Or
it's come under a lot of scrutiny, and one of the things was draining the money from ALEC did not allow them to lobby as hard, but there are still challenges in the legislative process.
Mass incarceration is obviously a huge issue amongst the Black community in the United States. I don't think a lot of Australians really appreciate what that actually means. Talk us through that experience for particularly for young Black men. Why are there so many young Black men in the prison system in the United States?
In terms of incarceration here in the States, it is largely based on wealth and access, and there are a lot of minor things that folks can get accused of that will criminalize them. And so things as small as not paying your parking tickets, you can end up in jail for that. Exactly. And so there's a system called cash bail in which you have to pay in order to get out of jail. And there are several states that are operating under a cash bail system, and it is all state-based. Prosecutors hold a lot of power, and they have the ability to end cash bail in their areas, which is largely why we want to identify champions for our communities and ensure that they're taking action. But one of the things that happens is the poorest people suffer the most. And so typically you see a lot of young black men across the spectrum, but also black women and girls who are being criminalized largely because of their inability to pay. Whenever anybody spends even 24 hours in jail, the consequences that happen after being in jail cause a ripple effect. Women can lose their children, people lose their jobs, they have to put we have these third parties that also have to get involved, where the family becomes collateral for the person who's seeking to get out, and they have to put their house up in order to get the bail. And so there are other things that happen as a result, and it causes a lot of strife in terms of the larger systemic issues within our country.
So you're at Colour of Change. This is a massive problem. You're an organisation. You sit down and try to work out strategies to overcome this. Where do you start, and what has your team's been doing around this issue?
So we have Colour of Change campaigns team is comprised of 4 teams. We have our digital and democracy team that really focuses on our voting rights work. We have our criminal justice team that focuses on all of our criminal justice work. We have our media, culture, and economic justice team. And then we have our political organizing team. And sometimes all of those issues converge. So for instance, right now, we are doing some work around education, and there are some environmental issues involved that our media, culture, and economic justice team would be looking at. But there's also some correlation between the school-to-prison pipeline and kids who are looking to be put into diversion programs in order to avoid criminalization. And so all 3 of these have converged. Our criminal justice team really leads our work when it comes to criminal justice issues, and they have set out 6 demands, and those 6 demands can be found on our site, winningjustice.org. But what actually happens is for my team, I focus on our political organizing work, where we're teaching our members to lead their own campaigns, to define the issues that impact their communities. And so they span the gamut. Some of them may be criminal justice. Some of them may be food deserts. For instance, all of the grocery stores in a particular neighborhood that is largely servicing black residents leaving. That's one of the issues that we're facing down in Florida. They've got a host of issues, the environmental issues and the education issues happening in Oakland with 24 school closings over the past 10 years. And so when we think about it, we think about what are the ways in which we can engage our members in this process, and ask them to come out from behind the computer and take action. And so one of the things that we start with is our petitions. It's a very easy ask. We send out an email, we ask them to take action, we run digital ads, and we let folks know that you can get involved. When you sign your name, we follow up with you, and we ask you, okay, how else would you like to be involved? We also invite you to community events, and we look at our program when we talk about our offline engagement in 3 steps. We first start with our community building, and the community building largely focuses on events that are motivating to folks and engaging for our community, but also they build capacity and they develop our skill sets. So building new leaders along the way in that process. The next thing that we do is we look at what is the direct need of that community and those people impacted. How do we service that need? Because it's an introductory step into making the next move. Once folks see that you're actually invested in their community, that you're seeding their community with resources and fulfilling their needs, then they're more likely to get engaged with the causes that you have. the last thing we do is we focus on what is the systemic change that we make. And so sometimes these things all happen at once, and sometimes it takes a little bit of a longer process. But it largely depends on the action of our members, and we base everything on how well does this test with our members.
When that second stage, when you start to bring the community together around an issue or issues, I think one of the challenges with organising is that you might have a multitude of people, but all have different issues that are important to them personally, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's that's what motivates them. And ultimately, we're just trying to build some sort of sense of urgency to get people, as you said, get them away from the computer and out on the streets and doing stuff. Does colour of change, when you're empowering local communities and local leadership, do you just let them work out what they want to take action around in terms of an issue, or are you running multiple issues in one particular community?
Yes. So it is yes and. Yes, we have a program and ways in which we think about engaging folks around criminal justice reform or media and economic justice. But we also allow our members to determine what it is that they want to do. And so our organizers who are on the ground, they are actively building squads and asking the members, how do you want to take action in this? We have a blueprint, but we are open to two-way feedback streams. And so we have this idea of this is what engages our community, but actually let's make it your own. What are the things that are motivating to this community? And so, for instance, this past weekend, we had a training in Los Angeles, largely focusing on teaching our members how to run their own campaigns. They had a host of issues come up, and they wanted this training. There were also major events happening in LA, and so for us that's always like do we want to do this on the same weekend, because we want to do it so as many people can participate and come out. Our members specifically said, I haven't been to that event in 3 years, we'll be okay, we'll recruit our own people. We had several folks come out, about 20 leaders come out and get trained. Each of them invited their own networks to our community event afterwards, and we had about 200 folks, and that's a guesstimate because we had some cards that folks filled out and some sign in, but ultimately we knew we had 200 plates and we were out of plates. There happened to be because this was a wide community event, there happened to be a birthday party that was right next door to where we were hosting in the park, and they came over, they got food from us, and they were like, what is Color of Change? We want to know about this. And so they ended up signing connection cards. When they heard we ran out of plates, they ran over with plates.
That's fantastic. We last couple of questions, because I know you're a busy person. We've got the election next year, 2020. Do you find that every day Donald Trump is on the front page making news? Is he a hindrance or a distraction to the good work that you're trying to do in communities?
He's neither. And so we really focus on hyperlocal. We think about what is the immediate thing that our members are seeing that they want answers for. And because we engage them directly and we talk to them, we don't really see a lot of input specifically about the president and what the president is doing. It's largely about how do we change this locally? And our members tend to get engaged and take action. Of course, we are still building a program focused on electoral turnout as a whole, but our members understand that we want to turn out Black folks who we call high potential voters, because ultimately what happens in Democratic campaigns is Black folks are left to the turnout audience, and they're the last that we seek. They expect Democratic campaigns know that we are loyal to Democrats, and so they come to us in the last 2 weeks, and they don't speak to our issues all throughout the campaign. Because Color of Change has been there all throughout, and we're focusing on what are those hyper-local issues that are plaguing the community. Folks tend to be more willing to engage. They tend to turn out in higher numbers, and we have a great time building a program that actually looks like and reflects us.
Look, I wish you guys the best of luck in the upcoming election campaign. You're doing amazing work. I really recommend anyone who's listening to jump online and just have a look at the amazing work that you guys are doing. It's groundbreaking. Just today's session alone with our delegates that are on the Dunn Street mission, as they were walking out the door, they were saying this has been one of the highlights of the program thus far, and we've had some pretty good people on this program.
Thank you so much.
So that's high praise. So Shannon, we really do appreciate your time on the podcast today, and also participating in the Dunn Street mission. We wish you strength to your arm for the next 12 months as you lay up to this campaign and beyond.
Thank you. Same to you. Thanks for having us.